Hi, I wanted to take a little time to go over part of the book that I mentioned in a previous video. This is the book that was assigned as the course text for my Multicultural Perspectives course, and it is called Counseling the Culturally Diverse by Sue and Sue. And I had thought I was going to pull out the sections on racial identity development because he has a different theory of identity development for people from every different racial background. But as I started flipping through the book, I just found that I kind of wanted to start from the beginning. And I had a hard time even determining which pages to include because there's a lot that stands out to me about this on every page. And I hope that it'll be of interest to you and demonstrate some of the concerning bias in this program. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And so I'm just starting with this here. This is the preface of the book. And I'm going to go fairly quickly. I won't be reading everything on all these pages. There's 24 pages that I've got to go over, and I don't want this video to be super duper long. So I'm just going to kind of skim them, but please feel free to pause the video as much as you like in order to take the time that you need in order to read the book. And I apologize for your eyes if you're trying to read it as I'm scrolling. So here in the preface, he spends a lot of time talking about reasons why people might not like the book, reasons that it might bother people. But all of these are then attributed back to the person. So this, I think, he really lays out that you might not agree with this book, but every reason you might have for not agreeing with this book is a problem of yours. So here, the content is emotive. He says, it's likely to elicit strong emotions among readers because the content of the book challenges racial, gender, and sexual orientation realities and traditional therapeutic beliefs. Interesting. Challenges realities. And so students can have powerful feelings, defensiveness, guilt, anxiety, that prevent the self-exploration, which is a necessary component of cultural competence. So he's just saying you're probably going to get all defensive, but go with it and just believe what I'm saying in this book and don't react strongly to it. And so here he starts us out. I'm trying to scroll slowly enough that if you want to pause it to read, you can. He offers 4 little vignettes that are reactions from students to his book. And I'll read these out because they're pretty short. So reaction number 1, white female student. How dare you and your fellow caustic co-author express such vitriol against my people? You two are racists, but of a different color. I can't believe you two are counselors. Your book does nothing but to weaken our nationalism, our sense of unity and solidarity. If you don't like it here, leave my country. You are both spoiled hate mongers who take advantage of our educational system by convincing others to use such a propagandistic book. Shame on you. Your book doesn't make me want to be more multicultural, but take ungrateful people like you and export them out of this great land of mine. And so something that I noticed as I was reading these vignettes the first time I read this book, and it stands out to me again, is, well, one thing that really jumps out is that this is such an extreme position this person is taking, and the way that this person is talking, the way that this is written, I haven't really ever heard anybody talk like this in real life or write like this. This is just such almost a caricature of like a angry white person, right? Like they're like talking about their country and her people, and it's just, this is not language that I think is something that you would typically see. It seems like a very extreme example. So my suspicion is that the author made up all the vignettes in the book. That's my, as I read them, and I'm curious to see what other people think, but I see a similarity in turn of phrase and in the sorts of language that is used. And I also see a just they seem like they're written in order to fit the argument. So let me know what you think, but I'll go on. Here's a white male student reaction. I am a student in the field of professional counseling and feel compelled to write you because your text is required reading in our program. I am offended that you seem to think that the United States is the only perpetrator of prejudice and horrific acts. Excuse me, sir, but racism and oppression are part of every society in the world ad infinitum, not just the United States. I do not appreciate reading biased material that does not take into account all forms of prejudice, including those from minorities. You obviously have a bone to grind with white people. Minorities are equally racist. Why do you take such pleasure in attacking whites when we have done so much to help you people? So again, we have like this phrasing, we have done so much to help you people. That is just such like a cartoon bad guy sounding phrase. And then you'll notice he's got that he's capitalizes this word white, and that's his stylistic choice that he does throughout the book. So you can see that over and over again. And then remember this phrase here, have a bone to grind with white people, because you'll see something like that in another vignette. So moving on, Latina student. I am currently embarking on the journey of becoming a marriage and family therapist at a California State University. I just want to thank you for writing Counseling the Culturally Diverse. This book has spoken to me and given me so much knowledge that is beyond words to express. Finally, there is someone willing to tell it like it is. You have truly made an impact in my life because being an ethnic minority, I could empathize with so many of the concepts that were illustrated. Although some white classmates had difficulty with it, you truly validated much of my experiences. It reaffirmed how I see the world, and it felt good to know that I'm not crazy. Once again, thanks for writing the book. And so you can see again, here's this capitalized. That one doesn't, I don't know. It's not as cartoonish, you know. Seems like maybe it could be real, I don't know. Here we go, African-American male student, last vignette. When I first took this course, Multicultural Counseling, I did not have much hope that it would be different from all the others in our program, white and Eurocentric. I felt it would be the typical cosmetic and superficial coverage of minority issues. Boy, was I wrong. I like that you did not tiptoe around the subject. Your book, Counseling the Culturally Diverse, was so forceful and honest that it made me feel liberated. I felt like I had a voice, and it allowed me to truly express my anger and frustration. Some of the white students were upset, and I could see them squirming in their seats when the professor discussed the book. I felt like saying, good, it's about time whites suffer like we have. I have no sympathy for you. It's about time they learned to listen. Thank you, and thank you for having the courage to write such an honest book. We have this capital here. We have these little turns of phrase that just feel like the author to me. As you read his work, he has this like, these little flourishes, literary flourishes that I think that they stand out. And again, could be wrong. So scrolling through, here he says, he starts out by saying down here, it would be a mistake to conclude from these examples that white students and students of color respond uniformly in one way. Many white students react positively to the book, and some students of color report negative reactions, but in general, there are major worldview differences in reactions to the material between the two groups. And so in this, he's using these 4 examples that he has offered as representative of white responses versus the responses of people of color to the book. And I think it's easy to take exception with his choices for his white responses because they are really, really cartoony, I think. And so he's talking about worldview and cultural competence. And let's see, what did I want to show you about this one? Okay, it's clear that the 2 white students are experiencing strong feelings with the content of this book. The book deals with prejudice, bias, stereotyping, discrimination, and bigotry. It makes a strong case that counseling and psychotherapy may serve as instruments of cultural oppression rather than therapeutic liberation. And see, this is something you'll find a lot in his book here. He's like quoting himself. So say I. That's probably a bunch of examples of that throughout, because I noticed a few when I was looking at this. Okay, so he's going to have another little vignette, but this one's going to be from this guy, Dr. Mark Casellica, a white psychologist and now provost of a college in New York. He writes about his own negative emotional reactions to reading this book. So everybody's, although all these white people are really not liking the book. And he says he was shaken to his core the first time he read the book. He wished he had acquired the book because he was really interested in it, but he really just did it because he had to bone up on cross-cultural counseling for a comprehensive evaluation. And so he says, I didn't get very far with my highlighting and note-taking before I started to react to Sue's book with great anger and disgust. Early on in the text, Sue blasted the mental health system for its historical mistreatment of people who were considered to be ethnic minorities in the United States. He especially took on white mental health professionals, charging them with a legacy of ethnocentric and racist beliefs and practices that had harmed people of color and made them leery of counselors, psychologists, and psychiatrists. It seemed that Sue didn't have a single good thing to say about white America. So you see this phrase again, we saw that earlier, white America. And here he is. He had an axe to grind with white America. And we just saw somebody that had a bone to grind with white America. All right, so he tried to understand why he was so upset with the book, but he was drawn back to it again and again in spite of his initial rejection of it. I know it may sound crazy, but I read certain sections of Sue's book repeatedly and then reflected on what was happening inside of me. I began to discover important lessons about myself, significant insights prompted by reading Sue's book that would shape the direction of my future. I now realized that Sue was right. The system had been destructive toward people of color, and although my ancestors and I had not directly been a part of that oppressive system, I had unknowingly contributed to it. And so here he is admitting he hated the book so much, he thought it was all wrong. He just kept reading it, and through continued reading it, he discovered that it was all correct, and that he was a huge racist, and he had used the N-word, and he had blinders on. And so just reading this book enough times, even though he thought it was awful, showed him that he was just a giant racist. And so then he's generalizing to white people in general. He says, you see, the subjects I, white psychologist, am about to discuss, ethnocentrism and racism, including my own racism, are topics that most whites tend to avoid. We shy away from discussing these issues for many reasons. We are racked with guilt over the way people of color have been treated in our nation. We fear that we will be accused of mistreating others. We particularly fear being called the R word, racist. So we grow uneasy whenever issues of race emerge, and we tend to back away, change the subject, respond defensively, assert our innocence and our colorblindness, denying that we could possibly be ethnocentric or racist. So he is offering, as a representative white, insights into the reasons why many white trainees fear open dialogues on race, because they may ultimately reveal unpleasant secrets about themselves. So this whole section is kind of a giant Kafka trap, because here you are. If you think that there's something wrong with this book, if you read this book and you agree with it, well, then you're just a regular white racist. And so, accept that. But if you disagree with it for any reason, that's because of some problem with you, and it's probably because of your racism. So it's sort of just a circular, you damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And here's another section. I think, are we still in the preface? No, we're not. We're a little bit further along now. So here's another example of so it's still going on. These are reasons why you might not agree with the critical race theory model. And here's something that might happen. You might end up with cognitive resistance and denial. And an example of that is this person who is giving examples of how they ignored stories of discrimination from people who talked about racial discrimination. So it kept running a parallel reason for their scenarios from the white perspective. Here's the W, big white. A Chinese lady says that her party had to wait longer while whites kept getting seated in front of them. I say other people had made reservations. A black man says that the receptionist was rude and made him wait longer because he's black. I say she had a bad day and the person he was there to see was busy. So there's examples like this. Is this his friends? I don't know. Who is he talking to? How much information does he have about these scenarios? Maybe he's being a jerk and these people are, they have some reason to really think that this is what happened. Or maybe there's a cognitive distortion and he's challenging that. The way that he's saying this, I say she had a bad day and the person was, that sounds a little bit strong, like he's being insensitive, but I don't know. We just don't have a whole lot of information to go on here. So this is not a really helpful vignette, I don't think. But it's helpful to illustrate the point that he's making. And this is not an atypical response for many white trainees when they listen to stories of discrimination from classmates of color. All right. Going on down. So now we have about whiteness and privilege. There are denials that students are prejudiced, that racism still exists, that they are responsible for the oppression of others, that whites occupy an advantaged and privileged position, that they hold power over people of color, and even denial that they are white. This latter point, whiteness and white privilege, and you can see he's including himself again, like he just cites himself over and over. So say I. Is an especially hot topic that will be discussed in chapter 12. And here is somebody talking about emotional resistance, a white female psychologist. When somebody pushes racism into my awareness, I feel guilty that I could be doing so much more. Angry, I don't feel like I'm wrong. Defensive, I already have 2 black friends. I worry more about racism than most whites do. Isn't that enough? Turned off. I have other priorities in my life with guilt about that thought. Helpless, the problem is so big, what can I do? I hate to feel this way. That is why I minimize race issues and let them fade from my awareness whenever possible. So again, this is being what we're all supposed to feel. The meaning of anxiety and fear. So you might be afraid of admitting that you're racist and talking about race. All right. Defensiveness and anger. So we're still just going through why we might, as white people, not like this book. So when discussing diversity issues, many white trainees admit to feeling guilty, although most tend to say they are made to feel guilty by people of color, especially when unjustly accused. So say I. Sue. All right. All white people, this is behavioral resistance. I'm just scrolling through this for you guys. Please go ahead and pause again and read. How does one become a non-racist or unbiased person? What must I do to eradicate racism in the broader society? You have to become not just a non-racist person, but an anti-racist person. This will go into that a little bit. It's making sure multicultural curriculum is being taught in schools, openly supporting social justice groups. Cultural competence. And then here, this is interesting because they're saying that the way to become an anti-racist white person is to like be incredibly racist and talk and just pull out every racist trope and every nasty word you can think of about Black people and say them. Most whites begin with a good deal of amnesia. Eventually the memories crowd in, especially when several people pool recollections. Emotional release is a vital part of the process. And so I'm saying, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing like, is this what they're doing in these white accountability groups? Or are they just like putting out as much nastiness as they possibly can? And so, all right, going on. Social justice and cultural competence. And they talk about the 4 counseling relationships that are possible. A privileged counselor working with an oppressed client, a privileged counselor working with a privileged client, oppressed working with privileged, and oppressed working with oppressed. And then they go back and put this in racial terms. White counselors working with color, clients of color, counselors of color working with white clients, and so on. And so they put that right out for you. Here, he's talking here. This is an interesting one. If you take a little time to read this, he's talking about his own stance, his own experience, and his own bias. So that his teaching and training was primarily directed at educating white trainees and counselors to their own biases and assumptions about human behavior. I operated from the assumption of people of color knew much of the material on oppression, discrimination, and stereotyping. After all, I reasoned, we were members of the oppressed group and had experiential knowledge of how racism harmed us. Yet in the back of my mind, I knew I was shortchanging my trainees of color by making this supposition. I knew that they also had biases and prejudice toward one another, and that oftentimes their strong negative reactions toward white fellow students, albeit often justified, could prevent their development towards cultural competence. He used to operate from a common enemy perspective, presenting a united front among people of color. And what he's saying he does now is it's not that he's come around to see everybody as, potentially unique. It's not like he stopped being so common enemy towards white people. It's that he started recognizing that different ethnic groups might have biases against one another because they've internalized white supremacy. And that's what this goes on to basically go into. So here he's talking about, this is another vignette that you can read. And some of the turns of phrase, like they are phonies. He has this kind of antiquated, like sort of old-fashioned way of writing. And I just wonder, again, these vignettes, what does he know? How does he know what's going on inside my head? The truth be told, Sandy doesn't have anything to complain or whine about. She doesn't understand what discrimination really is. Maybe she has been treated poorly, but, well, I don't consider Asians people of color anyway. How can they claim to be oppressed when they are so successful? On this campus, they are everywhere, taking slots away from us. Sometimes I think they are whiter than whites. And see, again, like, does this seem like what a real person would say? The way that it's being said and what's being said here? And I don't know, maybe you think so, but. All right. And then here, I'll let you read this if you want to. Common challenges counselors of color face when working with white clients and clients of color. And I think this is pretty insulting and demeaning to these counselors. Right. This particular vignette here is pretty interesting. This one, I want to know also if people think that this is realistic. This is a supposedly a counselor, a white male counselor, who's describing an interaction with a Black client. And he says things like, even though I'm white, I tried not to let his being Black get in the way of our sessions. I treated him like everyone else, a human being who needed help. He's describing him in this kind of stereotyped way. And he's really impatient when he talks about it, this client. Not only did he appear reluctant to take responsibility to change his own life, but I felt he needed to go elsewhere for help. After all, this was a mental health clinic, not an employment agency. He's very impatient with him. Confronting him about his avoidance of responsibility would probably prove counterproductive. So I chose to focus on his feelings. Using a humanistic existential approach, I reflected his feelings, paraphrased his thoughts, and summarized his dilemmas. This did not seem to help immediately, as I sensed an increase in the tension level, and he seemed antagonistic toward me. After several attempts by Malachi to obtain direct advice from me, I stated, "You're getting frustrated at me because I'm not giving you the answers you want." And then Malachi gets angry and yells at him. And then he says here, "I must admit I was left with a very unfavorable impression of Blacks. I see myself as basically a good person who truly wants to help others less fortunate than myself. I know it sounds racist, but Malachi's behavior only reinforces my belief that Blacks have trouble controlling their anger, like to take the easy way out, and find it difficult to be open and trusting of others. If I'm wrong in this belief, I hope this workshop, Multicultural Counseling Therapy, will help me better understand the Black personality." And this is the very last page here. I'm not going to read this one out to you, but I just want to point one piece out. This is a supposed conversation between someone, a client named Gabriella, and her therapist, Dr. D. And this is him being kind of a clueless guy, and she's trying to get him to be culturally sensitive to her Latina, her culture, and so he's not, and that's the whole point of this little scenario. But there's one thing he says here that reminds me of that last piece, and this is a totally different part of the book. "You're angry at me because I don't seem to be supportive of your predicament, and you think I'm blaming you." The really directive kind of statement here sounds so similar to this one here, where he says, "You're getting frustrated at me because I'm not giving you the answers you want." All right, so I'm going to stop the share now. And so those last two examples, if those are true, they just sound like really, really poor therapists in the first place, because what kind of counselor is going to just tell the client why they're angry? Like, "You're getting frustrated because of this." I mean, and the examples of the stories, the vignettes, the supposed personal testimonies throughout the book, they don't seem representative of real people to me. And yet this is what the concept of social justice, anti-racist, race broaching, racial identity salience increasing counseling is based on. It's based on much of it based on this man's work, this book, and other books that he's written and research that he's done, and his influence in the field. And I hope that this has been interesting for you, and perhaps you can let me know in the comments what you think. I found this book to be really surprisingly, I was very surprised that this was the textbook for a graduate course. And I found that a lot of the material within was of dubious credibility. And I hope that this has been interesting for you, and thank you again for watching.